All right, let's jump right in. The decade after World War I is, hands down, one of the most paradoxical times in all of history. On one hand, you have this deep collective trauma and loss, but on the other, an absolute explosion of creativity, invention, and social change. So that's what we're going to unpack. The anxious and, well, the truly amazing 1920s.
To really get the mood of the era, you have to start right here. This famous line from the poet William Butler Yeats, it wasn't just pretty words, it was a diagnosis. The Great War had completely shattered the old world, and for so many people, it felt like the very foundations of, well, everything were just crumbling. And you can literally see that sense of disorientation etched on the faces from the time. See, before the war, people really believed in progress, this idea that reason and science were just going to keep making the world a better place. The horrors of trench warfare just blew that optimism to pieces. It left a whole generation of thinkers and artists feeling totally adrift, lost in what felt like a completely meaningless world.
So first, let's really dig into that psychological wound. This wasn't just about politics or economics. No, this was a deep crisis of faith and meaning that was echoing all across Western society. And another poet, T.S. Eliot, he gave this feeling the name that really stuck: the wasteland. He saw a world that had lost its spiritual center, a culture that was just barren and broken. And that feeling of disillusionment, it became a powerful theme for the entire decade.
Now, what's really fascinating is what happens when people feel this way. This profound uncertainty. It actually sparked a revolution in ideas. I mean, if all the old certainties were gone, thinkers had to find totally new ways to understand the universe, the mind, and life itself. And this shift was just massive.
For centuries, Isaac Newton had given us this comforting, predictable universe with absolute laws. It all made sense. Then, along comes Albert Einstein. His theory of relativity suggested that space and time weren't fixed things at all, but were actually flexible or relative. All of a sudden, the physical world itself seemed weird and uncertain.
At the very same time, Sigmund Freud was turning that exploration inward into our own minds. And what he said was pretty shocking. He argued that we are not the rational creatures we like to think we are. He said a huge part of our behavior is driven by this irrational, pleasure-seeking unconscious. So think about it. If the universe isn't certain, and you can't even trust your own reason, what's left?
Well, for philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre, the answer was a new philosophy called existentialism. They took this lack of universal meaning and kind of flipped it on its head. They turned it into a radical call for freedom. If the universe doesn't give you a meaning for your life, then it's up to you, each of us, to create our own through the choices we make. So meaning wasn't gone, it just became a deeply personal responsibility.
Okay, so you've got all these huge, world-changing ideas floating around. How did that actually show up in the real world? Well, you see it everywhere in the art. The artists and writers from this era, people we now call the Lost Generation, were desperately trying to invent new ways to capture this new, fragmented reality. And maybe nobody captured the spirit of the age better than F. Scott Fitzgerald. This last line from The Great Gatsby is so iconic because it just nails that feeling, that constant striving for a dream, for a future, that always seems to be slipping through your fingers, pulling you right back into the past.
And painters were doing the exact same thing. They completely abandoned trying to paint the world realistically. You had artists like Picasso using cubism to smash objects into geometric shapes, trying to show you multiple viewpoints at once. It was like they were saying, hey, there's no single true way to see things anymore. And then you had the expressionists, who used wild, distorted forms and bold colors to paint what it felt like on the inside. And then, of course, came surrealism, which was basically Freud's ideas put on a canvas. Artists like Salvador Dali were trying to tap directly into the unconscious, into the world of dreams. They created these bizarre, eerie images, like those famous melting clocks that just felt like they were from a world beyond reality. But here's the thing, that is only half the story. Because while all these thinkers and artists were grappling with this deep inner turmoil, a completely different kind of energy was absolutely exploding out in the wider world. So, welcome to the other 1920s, the Roaring Twenties. This was the age of jazz, of fast cars, and this thrilling, almost frantic search for anything new, for freedom, and for an escape from the long shadows of the war. And a huge piece of this new energy was the changing role of women.
I mean, after all their crucial work during the war, women in many countries finally won the right to vote. And with that came a new spirit. They shed the old restrictive clothes, cut their hair short into the famous bob, and started jumping into new careers, demanding way more freedom in every part of their lives. And the soundtrack to all this new freedom? It was jazz. Born from African American communities, its lively, improvisational beat just swept across America and Europe. It was the absolute perfect music for an age that wanted to break free from all the old, rigid rules. This sense of boundless possibility also took to the skies. Aviation was the great adventure of the day. The incredible, daring solo flights of pilots like Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart became these massive global events. They were like the rock stars of their time, and they proved that humanity could still achieve amazing, heroic things. Meanwhile, back on the ground, technology was literally shrinking the world. For the first time, cars were affordable for the middle class, giving people this incredible new freedom to move. The radio brought news and entertainment right into people's living rooms, creating a shared culture like never before. And Hollywood movies became a global sensation, creating this new, incredibly powerful mass culture. So how on earth do you make sense of this? How do you have these two completely different worlds coexisting in the very same decade? Well, that brings us right to the legacy of this incredible age of paradox. And this is really it right here. The whole story of the 1920s is the story of this tension. On one side, you have the quiet despair of the wasteland, a search for meaning in a world that felt broken. And on the other, you have the loud, roaring, joyful energy of the Jazz Age, a frantic rush toward a future of freedom and technology. The decade wasn't one or the other, it was both, all at once. And ultimately, that's the big takeaway. This chaotic, brilliant, contradictory decade forged the modern world we live in. The disorienting ideas from science and psychology, the new social freedoms, the birth of mass media, the relentless pace of change, all these things that define our lives today really have their roots right there in the 1920s. Which kind of leaves us with one final thought, doesn't it? We too live in an age of rapid, often disorienting change. And when you look back at the twin legacies of the 1920s, both the anxiety and the absolute amazement, it really makes you wonder, 100 years from now, what will people say was the legacy of our time?